The sky is such a charged landscape and one with so much history and so much, so many cultural associations. Sometimes we think about the sky as representing a kind of freedom, and there's something to that, but there's also skies that are filled with things like drones and satellites that are doing things like targeting people, or filled with microwaves and all kinds of electromagnetic infrastructures that are very much a part of the world that we live in. The Other Night Sky, at the simplest level, is a project to try and track and photograph all of the secret satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, mostly military and surveillance spacecraft. It turns out there's a group of amateur astronomers who, for several decades now, have gone out at night with telescopes and binoculars and tried to find objects in the sky. And when they see satellites, they write down what they saw. And then you go and look it up in international catalogs that describe everything in space. And if the thing that they find is not in one of those international catalogs, then they know that they've seen something secret. And so they write down the observation. Because satellites have to follow Kepler's laws of planetary motion, they're very predictable. Once you see one, you can model the orbit of it, and once you model the orbit of it, you can make predictions about where you might be able to see it again. And so that's what I do with the project, is to model these orbits, track these spacecraft, and go out with cameras that are attached to computer-guided telescope mounts. And when you do everything correctly and very precisely, and you get lucky, what you end up with is a photograph of the sky. And normally you have to take a pretty long exposure to see some of these. And so what you end up with are small streaks in the images that represent the trail of one of these secret spacecraft moving through the night sky. So within the overall body of work, there's photographs of active reconnaissance satellites that are looking down at Earth, but there's also photographs of dead satellites and space junk and things that have been discarded and are flying through space almost like ghost ships. And one of the images is looking at the disk of the moon, and next to the disk of the moon is one of these dead spacecraft. And I guess for me, satellites are in a way moons. And in fact, before the word satellite became popular, they were described as artificial moons. If you look at the early press releases around things like Sputnik or early satellites, they would say, oh, we're making artificial moons. I think that's interesting too. One of the things that I am constantly thinking about when I'm making art is, what does the world look like? And that seems like a silly question, but I think it's a very profound question, actually. If we take something like the night sky, this is something that humans have been looking towards for tens of thousands of years, at least, if not since the beginning of humans themselves. And when we look at the sky, we try to figure out something about who we are or where we came from or where we're going. And that's true of ancient Babylonian astrologers trying to figure out the future from the movement of the planets. And that's also true of the Hubble Space Telescope, looking at the edges of the universe to try to find the ultimate origins. And so when I'm thinking about making art, I think about the fact that anything that we look at has a history of hundreds or thousands of years of other artists and other people looking at that same exact thing. And how do you look at it in a way that speaks to your moment in time, which might be different than somebody else's moment in time? So I guess for me, the project is really about looking at the sky and seeing things that weren't there before, and seeing things that maybe say something about where we are now. In a lot of the photographs, we have pictures of the night sky where there's a small disruption, and if you just saw it, you might say, oh, that's a photo of the night sky. And then when you read the title will say something very specifically about some kind of reconnaissance satellite or a piece of space junk or what have you. To me, this is a strategy almost like Marguerite's, this is not a pipe, or this is not an apple, or what have you. It's taking images that we're familiar with and suggesting that those images might mean something different, or that it's not self-evident what is contained in an image, or it's not self-evident how we should interpret a particular image or interpret a particular landscape. I'm very cranky about space in the sense that I guess when I think about things like spaceflight or space travel, I really see a history of nuclear war. Spaceflight was not developed to go to different planets or that sort of thing. Spaceflight was developed to deliver nuclear missiles to the other side of the planet. And everything else is a byproduct of that. I often think that if there had not been a development of nuclear weapons and had not been a Cold War, that spaceflight would never have been invented. I guess when I'm making work, especially more landscape kind of oriented works, I really just think about what are the ways in which we are changing the landscapes around us, and how does that in turn change us? And if you look at something like a military like the US military that really has a planetary footprint, it's really the size of the planet, you look at all the aspects of that, how does that change what we imagine the planet to be? How does that change our societies? How does that change the landscapes that those infrastructures inhabit? The same is true of other kinds of things. If we look at something like the internet or global telecommunication systems or artificial intelligence networks, these are also infrastructures that have a planetary footprint, that exist at the scale of the entire planet and have enormous influence on the ways that our society is structured, politically, culturally, sociologically, economically. And for me, the task is to try to get a glimpse of that, and to try to form something like a visual vocabulary that allows us to think about these things, or gives us the opportunity to think about them, gives us the opportunity to reflect on the ways in which we are changing the Earth and what the effects of that might be.